Martin Collins, a wealthy and self-assured businessman, found himself drawn into a bet that would reshape his life in ways he could never have foreseen. Success had always come naturally to him, whether in boardrooms or personal pursuits, and the thrill of competition was his lifeblood. So, when his close friend Joe presented a daring proposition during an extravagant gathering in Buffalo, Martin couldn't resist. "Let's see if you've got the nerve for this one," Martin Joe challenged with a sly grin. "I bet you wouldn't dare to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual type." Martin, accustomed to his reputation for charming, beautiful women, raised an eyebrow, momentarily surprised. But the temptation to prove himself was too strong. "And what's at stake here?" he asked, his voice steady with curiosity. Joe lifted his glass, mischief twinkling in his eyes. $1 million to the winner. "But here's the catch: you have to marry her, and stay married for 6 months." The idea was outrageous, yet Martin, energized by the challenge and lured by the hefty prize, agreed without hesitation. The woman Joe had in mind was Emily Smith, a person who defied traditional notions of beauty. Martin had never met her, but to him, this was just another contest to conquer. Days later, Martin learned more about Emily. She was confident, fiercely independent, and unapologetically strong-willed qualities, unlike those of the women Martin was used to pursuing. This piqued his interest even further. Used to controlling situations and people, he began to wonder how he would handle someone who refused to bow to his influence. Their first meeting took place at an upscale restaurant. When Emily entered, her presence immediately stood out. She moved with a calm assurance that ignored the grandeur around her, or Martin himself. Instead of being daunted, she met his gaze directly, unflinching and bold. "You must be Martin Collins," Emily said, her tone crisp as she slid into the seat across from him. "And you must be Emily Smith," Martin replied, offering a measured smile as he extended his hand. Emily hesitated for a beat before shaking it, her grip firm and deliberate. "Let's not waste time dancing around the subject," she began, her voice steady and forthright. "I know exactly why we're here. I'm aware of the bet, the terms, and the expectations." Martin, though startled by her candor, kept his composure. "And yet you're here." "Why?" he asked, intrigued by her motivations. Emily paused briefly, her expression unreadable. "Let's just say I have my reasons. I'm not naive, Martin. 6 months may seem brief, but a lot can happen in that time. If you think you can sway or control me, you're mistaken." Martin smiled faintly. Emily was proving to be far more formidable than he had anticipated, which only deepened his interest. As their first meeting concluded, Martin realized that Emily wasn't just different, she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Her fearlessness stirred something unexpected within him, perhaps even a touch of admiration. In the following days, Martin found himself preoccupied with thoughts of Emily and their next interaction. Used to commanding every situation, he realized she played by her own rules, adding an unfamiliar unpredictability to the dynamic. Their second meeting unfolded in a modest cafe, an unexpected choice suggested by Emily. Curious and eager to uncover more about her, Martin agreed. The simplicity of the setting felt foreign to him, but he embraced it as part of understanding who Emily truly was. When Martin arrived, Emily was already seated, sipping tea and wearing a calm smile. Her demeanor was warmer than during their first encounter, yet she retained her unwavering confidence. "I thought you were more of a 5-star restaurant kind of man," Emily teased as Martin joined her. "Sometimes it's good to step out of routine," Martin responded, striving for an air of ease, though he felt slightly out of his element. They exchanged small talk for a while, but Emily soon steered the conversation to the point. "If we're going to do this, there are a few things I need to make clear," she said, setting her tea down with deliberate care. "I'm not interested in your wealth or the life it offers. 6 months is 6 months. I intend to leave this arrangement exactly as I entered it." Martin studied her intently. Her honesty was unmistakable, and she spoke with conviction. Emily was a woman who knew her worth, someone for whom marriage wasn't a ladder to societal elevation but a deliberate choice. "Then what do you want?" Emily Martin asked, his curiosity genuine. "Freedom," she replied without a second's hesitation. "I want you to understand that while we're bound by this arrangement, I won't sacrifice my independence. My life is mine, and no temporary agreement will alter that." Martin smirked slightly, intrigued by her resolve. If Emily desired independence, he was willing to concede it for him. The marriage was merely a technicality to secure victory in the bet. "Fair enough," Martin agreed. 6 months. After that, we go our separate ways." Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, ensuring he truly meant what he said. Though she had her reservations, she entered the arrangement with clear intentions and a steadfast determination to stay true to herself. Deep down, she suspected Martin might try to manipulate the situation, but she was equally confident in her ability to stand firm. The meeting concluded amicably, with both individuals leaving with their intentions clearly outlined. Emily was determined to hold on to her independence, while Martin would treat the marriage as nothing more than a transactional formality. Yet, as the wedding day drew closer, Martin began to sense that this arrangement might be far more complicated than he had initially envisioned. The ceremony itself was devoid of warmth, carried out with the precision of a business deal. Martin Collins, ever the strategist, was already envisioning himself as the clear victor. He was certain that 6 months would pass quickly, and that Emily, despite her resolute demeanor, would inevitably succumb to the allure of the opulent lifestyle he was about to present to her. Immediately after the vows were exchanged, Martin escorted Emily to his sprawling penthouse in the heart of Buffalo. A towering symbol of his success, the residence boasted expansive glass walls that reflected the shimmering city lights and was furnished with the finest, most exclusive decor. To Martin, this wasn't just a home, it was a battleground where he planned to win her over using the undeniable power of his material wealth. But from the very moment she stepped inside, Emily made her stance abundantly clear. She remained composed yet distant, her every move radiating defiance. Rather than showing awe or admiration for the luxury that surrounded her, she seemed utterly unimpressed. 6 months, Martin. Not a day more, Emily declared firmly, her voice steady as she walked to one of the massive windows, gazing out at the cityscape, as though the grandeur around her didn't exist. Martin smirked, his confidence unwavering. Resistance, he thought, was part of the game. Every woman who had crossed his path had eventually yielded to his charm and wealth. Surely Emily would be no different, or so he believed. In the days following the wedding, Martin unleashed every tool in his arsenal to sway her. Lavish jewelry, designer wardrobes, exclusive trips, he presented it all, fully expecting Emily to adapt to the lifestyle he had carefully curated. Yet, to his mounting frustration, she rejected every overture. "I don't need these things, Martin," she would say calmly, her tone infuriatingly steady. Her refusal to be impressed or swayed unsettled Martin deeply. For a man who had always gotten what he wanted, the challenge was both maddening and unprecedented. What began as a simple bet now felt intensely personal. Winning Emily over became a necessity, a way to reassert the control he prided himself on. He shifted tactics, escalating his efforts to impose his dominance. He discouraged her from continuing her job, offering dismissive remarks like, "You don't need a paycheck anymore," or "Your role as my wife should come first." When Emily stood her ground, Martin resorted to undermining her in more subtle ways. He manipulated her schedule, delaying meetings she deemed important, crafting scenarios to test her patience and resilience. Despite his relentless maneuvers, Emily remained steadfast, a formidable barrier to his attempts at control. Her unyielding strength only fueled Martin's resolve to break through. The atmosphere between them grew increasingly tense, their exchanges riddled with unspoken conflicts. Even in casual conversations, small provocations would surface, but Emily countered each one with sharp, incisive remarks. Her wit and clarity dismantled his every attempt to belittle or dominate her. One evening, after an especially strained exchange, Martin tried a different approach, one steeped in vulnerability. "I just don't understand you, Emily," he said, his voice tinged with exasperation as he studied her. Any other woman would be thrilled to live surrounded by this kind of luxury. But you act as though it's meaningless. Tell me, what is it you truly want? For a moment, Emily remained silent, her expression unreadable. Then her eyes locked with his, revealing a depth of intensity he hadn't anticipated. What do I want? I want respect, Martin, she said, her voice unwavering. I am not some piece on your chessboard. You think money is the answer to everything, but it doesn't buy dignity. It doesn't buy integrity. You surround yourself with all of this. She gestured to the room, but inside you're hollow, and that's what you can't stand. Her words landed with the force of a physical blow. For the first time, Martin felt as though he was losing something far more significant than just control. Emily wasn't merely resisting his influence, she was tearing down the facade he had constructed over the years. It unnerved him. No one had ever challenged him in such a way, and the fact that Emily could see past his wealth left him feeling startlingly exposed. Rather than loosening his grip, Martin Collins decided to tighten it. He began crafting deliberate plans to isolate Emily Smith, aiming to make her realize how much harder life would be without him. He severed her connections, blocked opportunities that could advance her career, and even sabotaged significant events she had spent weeks organizing. But Emily was not the kind of woman who crumbled under pressure. Every setback only seemed to fortify her resolve. She stood taller, more determined than ever, holding onto her dignity with unyielding strength. She refused to let Martin dictate who she was or how she lived. Then, one evening, Emily made her move. Martin, she said, her tone calculated and sharp, you think you're the one pulling all the strings, don't you? But what you fail to see is that I have a plan too. And when the time is right, you'll discover this entire game is built on something far bigger than you can imagine. Her words stopped Martin cold. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated Emily. And for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind, a fear that he might not emerge victorious in this battle of wills. The weeks that followed were like a taut wire, stretched so thin it was on the verge of snapping. Martin, consumed by his obsession with control, tried every tactic he could muster to manipulate the situation in his favor. Yet, Emily stood firm, unshaken by his efforts. She was like an impenetrable fortress, resisting every attempt to break her. Ironically, Martin found himself growing more drawn to her as time went on. It was no longer just about her resilience, there was something deeper, something he hadn't expected. Emily was breaking down walls inside him, not through force, but by revealing the emptiness within them. For the first time, he saw her not as a challenge to conquer or a piece in his game, but as a person he genuinely wanted to understand. One night, after yet another heated exchange, Martin found himself alone in the expansive living room of his penthouse. He stared out at the city lights of Buffalo through the towering glass windows. Once, the glow of the skyline filled him with a sense of power and control. Now it only emphasized the hollowness within. How had he come to feel this way? Emily was just a woman he had married for 6 months, nothing more than a pawn in a bet. Or at least that's what she was supposed to be. But she wasn't. Somehow she had reached a part of him no one else ever had. She could see through the polished exterior he presented to the world, and that vulnerability shook him to his core. Meanwhile, Emily continued her routine, moving through their shared space with an air of quiet detachment. Her presence felt like a wall he couldn't breach, and the weight of it tormented him. Was it pride that made him want to break through? Or was it fear, the fear of losing something he didn't fully understand yet? Over dinner with his old friend Joe, Martin couldn't hide the strain any longer. "You're different these days," Joe remarked casually. "Normally by now, you'd have everything wrapped up, but it looks like this woman has you on your heels." Martin forced a smile, unable to form a quick response. He hated admitting it, even to himself, but Joe was right. Emily was challenging him in ways he'd never experienced before, and he had no idea how to regain control. That evening, Martin returned home with renewed determination. He needed to clear his mind and put everything back into perspective. but as he entered the penthouse, he found Emily sitting calmly on the couch, engrossed in a book. She looked so at ease, so untouchable, it both irritated and mesmerized him. "Can we talk?" he asked, breaking the heavy silence that had become their norm. Emily closed her book with deliberate calm and looked up at him. Her expression was serene, but her gaze was unwavering. "Of course," she said, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Martin took a seat across from her, struggling to find the right words. The air between them was thick with tension. He realized, for the first time, that he couldn't treat this marriage as a mere formality anymore. Something fundamental had shifted, and he needed to confront it. "What are we doing here, Emily?" he asked, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even him. "This started as a game, a bet, but now, I don't know what it is anymore." Emily studied him for a few moments before speaking, her tone measured yet piercing. "I'm not playing, Martin." I never was. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "From the beginning, I accepted this marriage for reasons that go beyond you. I don't care about the money or the control you think you have. I'm here for something far greater. And if you haven't figured that out by now, maybe it's time you opened your eyes." Her words hit him like a storm. He felt his chest tighten, frustration and confusion bubbling to the surface. "I know you're hiding something, Emily," he said, his voice laced with exasperation. "But what drives me crazy is that the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control, and I hate that." Unable to sit still, Martin stood and began pacing. The vulnerability she exposed in him was unbearable. Emily, however, remained composed. Slowly, she rose from her seat and walked toward him, stopping just inches away. His heart pounded in his chest as she spoke. "Martin," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "this isn't about control. You've spent your entire life trying to dominate everything and everyone around you. But with me, you're going to have to learn that control isn't always the answer. Sometimes you just have to let things be." For the first time, Martin saw her not as an adversary, but as someone who held a mirror to the parts of himself he didn't want to face. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily offered a faint, enigmatic smile that sent a chill down his spine. "I want you to figure that out for yourself," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Martin standing alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, the distance between them seemed to expand, yet in an inexplicable way, Martin Collins found himself feeling more drawn to Emily Smith than ever before. His thoughts were consumed by her, what she was hiding, what her true motives might be. But at the same time, he felt an unsettling loss of control over his own emotions. The realization that Emily was reshaping how he viewed the world shook him to his core. For a man who thrived on control, the depth of her influence was terrifying. The 6-month marriage arrangement was nearing its end, but for Martin, each passing day stretched into an eternity. Sleep eluded him. The sense of a looming revelation, something monumental, just beyond his reach, gnawed at him relentlessly. Emily had become more than the woman he married. As part of a bet, she was an enigma, someone who seemed to hold answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask. Martin's obsession with understanding her consumed him entirely. He chased every possible lead, hiring investigators, delving into her past, and scrutinizing every facet of her life. Yet, no matter how many stones he turned, the picture only grew murkier. Every step he took revealed Emily's meticulous planning. It was as if she had been orchestrating the entire game from the very beginning, always 2 moves ahead of him. One evening, after a tense business meeting, Martin returned to the penthouse later than usual. The light on the balcony caught his eye, and there was Emily, seated and gazing out over Buffalo, as though surveying an empire. Her quiet, commanding presence unsettled him. Tonight, Martin was certain, was the night he would finally get the answers he craved. Taking a deep breath, he stepped outside, his resolve tempered by a nagging fear of what she might reveal. "I need answers," Emily, Martin said, his tone firm though his heart pounded. "I can't keep playing this game. You need to tell me the truth." Emily exhaled slowly, rising from her chair with a deliberate calm. When she turned to face him, her usually composed eyes gleamed with something new, something fierce and unrelenting. "The truth, Martin," she asked, a bitter smile tugging at her lips as she crossed her arms. "Do you really want to know?" He nodded, though the tension in the air thickened with every second. Martin braced himself, but nothing could have prepared him for what she said next. "You have no idea who I am," Emily began, her voice cold and deliberate. "You've always seen people as pieces on your chessboard, haven't you? But this time, Martin, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the very start." Martin's confidence wavered as a shiver ran through him. The certainty he had always felt about his control was beginning to crumble. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily's cutting words silenced him. "Do you remember the name Smith?" she continued, her voice gaining an edge of sharpness. "Of course you don't. People like you never do. My father owned a small company, a struggling one, until you came along and destroyed it." Martin stumbled back a step, his eyes widening as fragments of memory began to stir. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice laced with disbelief. Emily stepped closer, her gaze blazing with anger and pain. "My father, Martin, he was an honest, hard-working man trying to support his family. Then you came along and took everything. You ruined him. You drove him to despair. And do you know what happened next? He killed himself." Her voice broke momentarily, her composure faltering as tears welled in her eyes. "My father took his own life because of you, because of your greed and your so-called empire." The weight of her words struck Martin like a physical blow. Memories of deals and acquisitions, of lives and livelihoods uprooted in his relentless climb to the top, flooded back to him. He couldn't remember all the faces, all the companies he had crushed, but now one story stood out sharply, a haunting consequence of his ambition. "Emily," he began weakly, desperation in his tone, I didn't know. I never." "No," Emily interrupted, her voice rising with raw emotion. "You didn't know because you didn't care. You took everything from us without a second thought. While you lived in luxury, my mother and I were left to scrape by, wondering if we'd have food for the next day." Martin stood frozen, her words tearing through him. He wanted to defend himself, to find some justification, but nothing he could say would undo the damage she described. Emily took a steadying breath, her tone shifting to something coldly calculated. "When I learned about your little bet, I saw my chance. I walked into your world deliberately, knowing exactly what I was doing. I accepted this marriage, not for your money or your control, but to make you feel, even for a moment, the powerlessness and pain you've caused others." Martin's knees felt weak as the gravity of her words set in. The tables had turned, and for the first time he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Emily had orchestrated everything, and now he was the one left vulnerable, the one being played. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't realize." "No, Martin," she cut him off, stepping closer until their faces were mere inches apart. "You didn't realize because you never cared enough to see the lives you destroyed. But I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to make sure you never forget. The pain you've caused will haunt you for the rest of your life." Emily's words fell over Martin like a judge's verdict. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the real weight of his actions. The crushing guilt that enveloped him was unbearable, and in that moment he realized he had lost far more than a simple bet. He had destroyed something intangible, something irreplaceable. As Emily stepped away, the silence of the penthouse seemed deafening. Martin's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the space she had just occupied. His mind was consumed by the storm of her revelation. Every word she had spoken felt like a hammer, breaking apart the world he thought he knew. The control he once prided himself on had slipped entirely from his grasp. For the first time, Martin felt powerless. Emily didn't give him time to process what she'd said. After delivering the full truth about her family's suffering and her father's death, she left the room, leaving him to face the overwhelming weight of his guilt alone. In the days that followed, Emily's actions mirrored Martin's greatest fear. She ignored him entirely. Her silent presence was a constant reminder of his failure. She moved around the house as if he were invisible, her gaze never lingering on him. At meals, she barely acknowledged his existence, speaking only when necessary, and even then, not to him. When Martin attempted to bridge the gap, his words faltered, unable to pierce the wall she had built between them. Martin Collins, the man who had always commanded attention, who thrived on being at the center of every room, was now a ghost in his own home. The absence of her attention cut deeper than any harsh word could have. Emily managed her life with the same composure as ever, speaking to the staff, making calls, handling her personal affairs, all while treating Martin as though he didn't exist. The forced silence became a weapon, slowly dismantling the image of the man Martin had once believed himself to be. One morning, Martin gathered what courage he had left and called out to her as she prepared to leave. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. Emily paused but didn't turn around, her hands busy adjusting her coat. The air between them grew heavier as Martin waited for a response, desperate for some acknowledgement, even if it was anger. But Emily said nothing. She simply opened the door, stepping out into the world beyond and closing it softly behind her. That sound, the gentle click of the door, echoed in Martin's mind long after she was gone. The pain of being ignored by someone he had come to see as more than just an adversary was unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Martin was used to control, to winning every battle, but now he was the one being subdued. Emily's disdainful silence cut sharper than any argument, leaving him with a growing sense of helplessness. Each time she left him alone, he felt the weight of his failure settle deeper into his chest. Emily didn't stop at silence. She began dismantling Martin's confidence in subtle but excruciating ways. At work, meetings were inexplicably rescheduled without warning. His decisions, once taken as gospel, were now openly questioned. Projects he had championed mysteriously fell apart. Martin knew Emily was behind it all, though she never openly admitted her interference. Her calculated moves felt like invisible threads, pulling apart the fabric of his carefully curated life. At home, her disdain was unyielding. She avoided sharing meals with him, refused to engage in any conversation beyond the superficial, and treated his attempts at reconciliation as an annoyance. One night, Martin found her sitting peacefully in the living room, a book in her hands. The serene scene felt like a carefully laid trap. He sat down across from her, his voice trembling with desperation. "Emily," he began, "I know I've done terrible things. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But please, can't we at least try to work this out? Can't we just talk?" Emily closed her book slowly, without lifting her gaze. When her eyes finally met his, they were colder than he had ever seen. "Talk," she repeated, her tone laced with bitterness. "What's left to say, Martin? You think words can undo everything you've done? Words are meaningless?" Martin's voice cracked as he tried again, standing and stepping closer to her. "I was wrong, Emily. I know that. I'll do anything to fix what I've done. I can change. I promise you I'll change." Emily stood as well, her piercing stare holding him in place. "Change?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Do you think changing now will erase the years of pain you caused? Will it bring back my father? Will it undo the nights I spent wondering how we would survive?" "No, Martin, it won't." Her presence loomed closer, and Martin felt himself shrinking under the intensity of her gaze. "What you do now isn't for me," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "It's for you. You'll live with this guilt for the rest of your life, Martin. And that, I promise you, will be your punishment." For the first time, Martin understood there would be no easy redemption, no simple path to forgiveness. He wanted desperately to repair what he had broken, but Emily was far beyond any simple repair. In the days that followed, Emily's disdain only grew. Her cold glances and sharp indifference were inescapable. Every time Martin tried to show he was changing, to prove he was capable of becoming better, she met him with sarcasm or silence. His frustration turned to desperation, each failed attempt at reconciliation leaving him feeling more defeated than before. One evening, after a catastrophic day at work where a key project had crumbled, Martin returned home to find Emily on the phone, laughing softly. He lingered just out of view, catching fragments of her conversation. She was discussing his failures, his unraveling. And in that moment, he realized Emily was the architect of his downfall. When she ended the call, Martin was waiting for her in the living room, his expression hollow with exhaustion. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but trembling with frustration. "At work, here. You're destroying my life." Emily crossed her arms, her face unreadable but calm. "Destroying your life," she echoed, a faint trace of amusement in her tone. "I'm simply returning the favor, Martin. But don't worry, I won't ruin you financially. That would be far too easy. No, I want you to live with this pain. I want you to feel the weight of every small loss, just as I did. I want you to watch everything you built crumble and know, with every fiber of your being, that it's your fault." Her words left Martin breathless. He had always been the one in control, the one dictating the terms. Now, he was at the mercy of someone who had every reason to bring him to his knees, and she wasn't finished yet. Martin Collins felt his world slipping further from his grasp. For years he had been the master of his destiny, the man who bent others to his will. Now he found himself ensnared in a slow, deliberate unraveling. Emily Smith's revenge wasn't loud or immediate. It was calculated, precise, and excruciatingly personal. She didn't want to destroy him in a single blow. No, she wanted him to feel every small defeat, every glance filled with disdain, until regret was all that remained.